So, hello and welcome to Canada's History's Fall Webinar Series, even though we are getting into winter now. This series revolves around women's history. Presenters have been and will continue to speak about prominent figures, moments, and places in Canada's women's history, as well as what has influenced the teaching of women's history in the classroom and what it looks like today. My name is Jessica Knapp, and I am your host for this series. And tonight, Diane Vautour will share her experiences and advice for teaching women's history in the classroom. This is the 6th of the 7th webinar in the series, so one more December 16th after this. Canada's History is proud to bring you this webinar series, as well as our many award opportunities and publications. So if you're ever interested to see if you qualify or to learn about the recipients of those awards, you're welcome to check out our website. And if you go to canadashistory.ca/awards, the link is actually on the screen now. Click on it and explore. We just had an award presentation in Ottawa at Rideau Hall in October, and it was excellent. So there's a fresh batch of recipients to get to know, and you'll see more content and more webinars with the recipients of those awards as we move forward. Canada's History is dedicated to promoting greater popular interest in Canadian history, principally through publishing, education, and recognition programs. Our flagship publications are Canada's History Magazine and Kayak Canada's History for Kids. If you haven't seen either of them, I recommend you go to your local grocery store or drugstore and just look through a copy and see if it's something you'd be interested in, and if so, sign up for a subscription. And if you'd like to know more just through the web, we have both of those links are clickable for you now, and you can save those tabs and check them out another time. So each year, Canada's History recognizes excellence and honors the achievements of history makers and enthusiasts of all ages, predominantly through the Governor General's History Awards and the Government of Canada History Awards, as well as a few other awards programs. So if you would like to know more about these, as I mentioned earlier, you can follow the links on the screen. And in all cases, you are all always welcome to send me an email if you'd like to talk to me and ask me some questions. Finally, Canada's History's vision is a Canada where people are deeply engaged in connecting with their shared past. That is what we would like to see. So a few housekeeping things for this evening and a few reminders. To ensure the best experience possible, I encourage you to close down any unnecessary programs your computer is running. So I shut down Photoshop and iMovie, and because I'm on a Mac right now, and any other large programs like that. Skype is pretty big. You might want to close that one down if you're using it earlier. And in case there are any issues, don't worry too much. We are recording tonight's webinar, and it will be available on YouTube in the next. I usually get them up by the end of the week, but it might be next week this time. But if you are registered for the webinar, I have your email, and I will email you when it becomes available. That's how convenient this is. So for everybody who is not watching tonight and is watching the recording now, thanks for watching. We are on social media. We are on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram, although I haven't updated this slide with our Instagram account. You're welcome to follow us and like us and tweet at us and post on our Facebook wall. Tell us what you like about the webinar. Start a conversation on social media and see what happens and see how many other people are interested in what we're talking about tonight. And as I mentioned earlier, the chat box in the bottom right-hand corner is available to you to use tonight. You can use this to communicate with Diane, and throughout the rest of the night, Diane will hopefully respond verbally, because I think that would be much easier for her and much easier for us too. So without further ado, I'll give a quick introduction to who Diane is, and we'll start off tonight. So Diane is a secondary school teacher with the Toronto Catholic District School Board in her 14th year of teaching, 10 of which have been spent teaching all girls. She is an executive director for the Ontario History and Social Sciences Association of Ontario, an organization that seeks to improve the instruction of history and social sciences in the province. She is a co-author of Canadian Sources Investigated, a textbook that prioritizes the use of primary sources and inquiry in the grade 10 history course. She has been working with the Ontario Ministry of Education over the last 2 years as a reviewer and lead writer of e-learning courses in the subject areas of social sciences and history. This has helped her examine how to embed the dimensions of 21st century learning in independent online studies. In 2010, she was a recipient of the Governor General's History Award for Excellence in Teaching for a role-play activity in which students debated the Wartime Elections Act as pioneering feminists, journalists, and politicians. This year, she has started a new position as Department Head of Canadian World Studies, Social Studies at a large co-ed high school. So without further ado, I will upload Diane's presentation while she joins us with audio.
Okay, hi everybody. I hope you can all hear me, and if there are any if you have any audio issues, you can certainly just indicate in the chat there on the bottom right-hand side of your screen. So I will begin by just noting that I am at a new school this year teaching co-ed students, and I had the pleasure of teaching all girls for 10 years, and these are my lovely students who participated in our very large role plays. You can see there we were working with a few classes, and it was a pretty large endeavor. And I will explain to you how we planned and carried out this role play. You can certainly adapt it to any of the situations that you find yourself in, whether you be a classroom teacher or maybe perhaps somebody who is advising teachers or involved in keeping history alive at any other level. I'm going to give you this link here, which I posted in the chat on the bottom right there. That's a link to, it's a little outdated website in the sense that I think they're going to be phasing it out soon, but I haven't moved my role play page over to my new website, so you can still go on there and see all of the links to all of the characters that these young ladies are playing and the research that they would have undertaken to prepare for their roles. So the role play is called We'll Get You Yet, and that was it's kind of taken from the attitude of suffragists and suffragettes during the early 20th century. It was a little tongue-in-cheek. Many of them were witty satirists and speech makers, and certainly in Canada they achieved their political means through more wit than, say, through violence that we saw in the UK and in America. So that became part of our discussion for the role play as well. So without further ado, we'll get started with explaining what happened in terms of my preparation for the role play. I have a sort of go big or go home attitude, and I had very cooperative students for 10 years. Teaching co-ed now is a little bit different. The cooperation is not where it was teaching all girls. Certainly have to adapt a few things. Well, the best part of teaching co-ed right now is I have boys to play the male roles, but we had girls play those roles when we did it as in our old girls' school as well. So what I decided to do was start to tailor my course to teaching all girls and to teaching Canadian history through the narrative of women's history. I'm still doing it as a co-ed teacher but incorporating it perhaps not as the only lens, the primary lens, since when I taught all girls, we had female empowerment as our school goal, so it obviously fit in there very well. But it sort of started with looking at this cartoon here, which is a very controversial one, and I think one in which students of all genders would recognize in terms of social justice and belittlement and patronizing. This idea of women asking men for the vote and begging for the vote like a dog. This is from the Glenbow Archives, such a great source of primary documents and images. And this happens to be a premier of Saskatchewan, and he had sort of the male stance of, well, he wanted women to beg for the vote before he would actually give it to them. So I started to think about, well, how exactly did women get the vote? What tactics did they use? What language? What would have been their perspective, their mindset? And I thought that was very fruitful in terms of looking at the different women's groups and what, great activity this would be in historical perspective to also incorporate the men's groups as well, because most of the men who voted for female suffrage were, listening to the women. They had the women had their ear, and most of the legislation we've seen in favor of women has been voted for by men. So I think, I just told my students, we were talking about that today, and that was sort of an eye-opener for the boys as well, to understand that they have kind of a role as allies here in trying to extend and guarantee gender equity in the country. So that image was a starting point, or if you will, like a minds on or a hook for the students to consider. And then, of course, there's this very well-known image of the nursing sisters voting in World War I, and this is the legislation that is the focus of the role play, the Wartime Elections Act, which accorded the vote to women in World War I. We did a lot of research into a lot of sources, and it's not entirely clear if the nursing sisters were voting because they were also related to relatives, or if in fact the government gave them the vote simply because of their contribution to the war effort. But it does start a good discussion of whether or not, what is the role of women? Is it always in relation to a man? Is her value always in relation to a male in her life? And that becomes a very interesting discussion for both boys and girls. Obviously, teaching all girls and teaching co-ed now, it becomes something to discuss in terms of what the value of a woman was at that time and how she saw herself. If her value increased because she was related to a soldier, how did the women feel who were not nursing sisters or who were not related to a soldier but were making equal contributions to the war effort? Did this divide women? Was that part of the intention? What happens when a government pits one group against another group when in fact it should be one sort of group in solidarity fighting for their rights? So there's lots and lots and lots of layers to this topic, and the other two documents that we looked at in great detail were, of course, your fave and mine, Nellie McClung. I will name my first daughter after her if that ever happens, but she wrote, a lot of very strong pieces against war. The topic of what was the point of war and women as victims of men's poor decision making, that women pay the ultimate price for war. So even teaching co-ed this year, we had a big discussion about sacrifice and who should have had their voices heard in making decisions during the war, declaring war, reacting to war. And a lot of my boys said that, well, it was the soldiers who were going to go get hurt and get injured and sacrifice and make the greatest sacrifice. And certainly that's the narrative of war that we've heard for the last century, or even, in Canada, but all over the world, that it is a man's sacrifice, and that's a very strong point. So where does a woman's, fit into in terms of that narrative? is Nellie McClung totally off her rocker here by suggesting that it's women who paid the greatest sacrifice? What does that say about the man's role and her position to that argument of men making the greatest sacrifice? And then another great writer who's offers a lot in terms of for teachers for inspiring a lot of conversation and debate is Frances Bainon. She also had a sister, I believe her name was Lillian. They were both journalists, and that also intrigued me, the idea of a female journalist in the early 20th century. I started to do with the students a lot of research into pioneering news reporters, and that's not something that we really see in textbooks or, you know, any kind of little vignette on Canada's history that we might, you know, catch on a commercial or Historica or something. And she was very outspoken, certainly willing to put her neck out there and suggest that, again, it was women, if they would get the vote, there would be no more. And that's something, once we have, you know, hindsight, did it actually happen? Were women able to prevent conflict once they had a lot of political rights and voice? If you believe that they do have it today, how come they weren't able to have a say in preventing further conflicts? And so this was a great discussion point with my co-ed students this semester. So those are my kind of primary sources that I was looking at and kind of brought to, you know, to my students to think about in terms of perspectives around this time period, and also change in continuity in terms of the role of women and the role of men. So the actual legislation is the Wartime Elections Act, 1917. Obviously, we know the whole story of the Union government and Borden and maybe stacking the vote in his favor, but it is what it is. It did afford women a political voice, some women at least, and then after the war it was furthered to white women, white women. And we talk about how do you get rights as well. If you're going to be given rights and you don't like the way that it's given, maybe in this kind of backhanded way, women say, well, no thank you, I would rather it be given to all women. We have talks about other feminists like Alice Paul, who was unwilling to extend the suffragist movement in the United States to black women because she felt like it would derail the movement. And what does that do to a movement when you are trying to achieve equality but can't be inclusive because it would be too groundbreaking or too sensational to ask for the vote for other races and ethnicities? So aside from all of that, this is the key piece, a turning point for women, and they're afforded some political presence. They have to take an oath. So the oath is that they swear that they're the wife, widow, mother, sister, or daughter, and there's lots of primary sources in the Hansard record of male politicians saying, well, how can we make sure, and can we get a registered list, and they might be lying, and it's very interesting to see the reaction towards extending the franchise, opening up maybe some of the political power, and the fear of what women would do with the vote. Now, certainly prohibition, well, maybe confirm some of these men's ideas. Stephen Leacock, for sure, who thought if a woman got the vote, they'd take away alcohol, and he was right. So I think there is some humor in here as well in terms of the role of a woman and moralizing society and what will she do once she has a say. So they have to take this oath, and then they are given the vote. So we're going to, in the role play, debate that Wartime Elections Act and this oath and this idea of giving women the vote. I took this from the delegation that Nellie McClung brought to Roblin in Manitoba, and I just maybe massaged it a little bit to happen in the House of Commons. And the The delegation was coming to the federal government, and the conservatives and liberals were debating this, and the delegation of women included all kinds of different, which I'll go over in terms of division of roles. Before the role play, I also am a big proponent of cross-curricular projects and involving many classes, as many classes as possible. When we did the role play, it was in a small school, so maybe 550 students. Currently, I'm in the school with 1,600 students, and I'm not sure in terms of how that would work out, but I wanted to also bring the grade 12 CHY students, West in the World students, into this as well. And so they staged the mock parliament. And that mock parliament, you can find the script for it easily online. And they were tasked with studying and performing the play, understanding the early feminist movement in Canada, America, and or Britain. And at the end of the day, they had to write a eulogy for a selected suffragist or suffragette. So they had their own thing going on, and all of the participants in the role play were invited to the play, and they had to learn their roles and deliver the play. And I was playing Prime Minister Borden, and we had to come watch the play. So this is the performance of the play. We have the females taking on the roles of male politicians, because in the play, the mock parliament play, the roles are switched, and it's the men who come begging for the vote. So we have signs like, "We have brains, why not let us vote?" And the men have to come in and sit on the floor, and the women heckle them and talk about what will happen if we give custody to male parents. In the case of a divorce, since custody was automatically awarded to the father, well, what will happen to the children, right? So it's a tongue-in-cheek, and there's Roblin there on bench, suffering the humiliation of having everyone go to this play who he thought were his friends. And so his perspective is a very interesting one. And there in the pink is our Grand Dame, Nellie McClung. And it was very successful. We ran it for 3 or 4 years, different kids playing different roles as they moved from grade 10 to grade 12, so it was a nice continuity there. And they made up invitations, they got dressed up as suffragists, and they went around the school and invited classes to the play, and they really got into that idea, handing out pamphlets at lunch and acting like the suffragists of the time, slipping it in between books in the library so that they could get people to attend, since women had to be very creative in organizing at this time. Thank you, Evelyn. I love the idea as well. They also would, pretend like this was not a favorable position to want to rock the boat. So they got a little bit creative in inviting people to watch the play. And I think there's a video of the play as well. Just going to double check. I think it's coming up. And you can see kind of what the play looked like if Jessica wants to get that up and running. You can see once it loads is that in the front row, if you see all of those hats there, those are the reporters who are actually writing about the performance. They had to create a newspaper with a play review. Some of them are conservative Christian women who this would have totally not coincided with their worldview. And that's one of the things we explored, the idea of, well, not all women actually were suffragists. They were against the idea of giving women the right to vote, just like many men were actually in favor of it. So I think sometimes students think in absolutes. Well, if you were a man during that time period, you would not have been in favor of female suffrage. If you were a woman, then definitely you would have been out there on the streets, or you would have been harboring thoughts of violent rebellion and stuff like that. But in fact, there were many Christian women's groups who were very, very opposed to bringing women out of the home, and they were even more opposed during the war, when women were talking about getting rights while soldiers were suffering, and that was considered to be very not very patriotic, and it stalled the women's movement quite a bit, actually, World War I, both in Canada, United States, and Britain. I would say in Britain the most, because they were very close to the war effort. Well, they were very close, obviously, to the war. And it just was not right to be talking about, well, complaining about anything while soldiers were dying. So the journalists are there in the front, and the man there with his, played by a grade 12 student female, is Roblin, and he's watching the play, and there are his friends, who he thought were his friends, actually, across from him, who were actually quite delighted in seeing him made fun of on stage. Yes, Evelyn, you're right. There were many women who felt like they were too, I often use the word precious, but, you know, there's a lot of images of like a woman's world was being at home with children, painting, playing the piano, entertaining, to be looked at. And they were, many of them, very comfortable in that role. The one thing that taught me that kind of the most was Bomb Girls. I don't know if anyone ever watched that on Global. Great sitcom, actually. Well, it's a great show about women during World War II, and it showed all the different kinds of women's experiences, because it's sometimes easy to just talk about a group as a collective and assume they all had the same history, but in fact they had many different kind of histories. And so I tried to bring in all kinds of different characters, and we had them sometimes in opposition to each other when you thought they might be in solidarity simply because of their gender. I agree, Evelyn, that felt their best role was in the home, that actually was the most noble job. And I do have a lot of stuff to say tonight about housewives, and a very good resource on housewives, actually, in terms of their important position in society, and mothers.
The lights are in the house and the curtains open to reveal the Women's Parliament in full session. The speaker in purple velvet hat with her sweeping flower entered. Pages answered the many calls of the government members, who looked extremely bored. The opposition had the floor, and the honorable member from Mountain was again introducing her bill to give the father equal guardianship rights with the mother.
It is nature's way. It is a grave injustice done to a father who has no claim on his offspring.
Hear, hear. The government members gave her little attention. They read their papers. One of the younger members powdered her nose. Some even ate chocolates.
I introduce you to the delegation of men.
Oh, you're so cute.
I urge the men to be given the right to vote and sit in Parliament. Men are equal to women and deserve equal rights.
Equal?
Men are not even people.
They were all in a pleasant mood and laughed at every point. It really did not seem to take much to amuse them.
So please consider a point of view.
Point of view? I didn't even know men had points of view.
Politics would unsettle our men. Unsettled men mean unsettled bills. Unsettled bills mean broken homes, broken vows, and then
Not the D word.
divorce.
Okay, so that was sort of fun of the fact that what would happen if we gave custody to the man, and then all of the female politicians were laughing at that idea, because certainly we have also lots of subtext around divorce and custody and women's roles in the home. Yeah, so Evelyn mentions the women's roles in the home, the newspapers of the time, and I'll show some examples, I believe, here of there were things called Women's World or Women or Homemakers page, stuff like that, where they promoted the women's role in the home and they were always suspicious of suffragettes. And there were also even sometimes little hidden codes in those pages where they'd say like, oh, tonight on, Windermere, there will be a book club meeting at the home of Mrs. Edward Dennison or something. And that was really a meeting of suffragists, but they couldn't really publicly print that. So the students really like to find those hidden codes and those hidden meetings that were going to happen. The Pankhurst women came over from Britain, actually to Toronto during this time, and they had to pretend they were coming over to do literary clubs. And in that way, I thought it was they loved the idea of the American, British, and Canadian suffragists meeting each other and strategizing, sharing war stories, if you will, about how to get the vote. And I thought it was interesting, too, that they had very different tactics, and I'll show you how we studied those as well. They liked, as Canadians, the idea that women got the vote first, before the British, before the Americans, and they used much more civil tactics. That's a very Canadian thing to feel proud of. And I think women understood, a lot of them, their limitations, as Evelyn notes there, and they were going to work with what they were dealt, the cards they were dealt with. Some students, say like, well, why didn't they do what the British women did, right? Just rip up artwork and start fires and get arrested and hunger strikes. And then we talk even about like civil disobedience and how you get things done and what's more effective. It's certainly not maybe the stuff of movies, since we have now movies about both the American and British suffragist movements, but not one about the Canadian one. And so I think sometimes as Canadian history teachers, we kind of look at the Americans and British because they have all of this sensationalized history, and we have mock parliamentary plays. That's how the Canadian women worked within the context that they were operating in. And that's a very important concept for historical thinking, that you are an actor within a context, and you are living in certain conditions, and those are sometimes limiting factors, or they are factors that might increase your movement, and those are sometimes outside of your control. And so the grade 10 history classes then staged a debate. They would select a politician from the Hansard record, and we read the Hansard record painstakingly. They happen to have a copy of it at the Toronto Public Library at Yonge and Bloor. And you can, even if you don't have it, access it online anyways. And this is a great point. We've actually talked about it today with the famous five, that there were many women who didn't have time for civil disobedience. And they also, might have been working and didn't have necessarily all of this time to plan and strategize. I think that's a very interesting and important point, especially when talking about the fight for personhood. And the idea that they had to depend on a man for their survival was a reality that an idea that they couldn't really, they couldn't really jeopardize that, right? So they had to be secretive. Okay, so then we had a press gallery, so a parliamentary debate, press gallery where they played journalists, and then the delegation. The background work was to do a little bit of cross-cultural comparison. And I have not seen this movie Suffragette, but I used Iron Jawed Angels. That was a really, really good one. Alice Paul is an interesting character, and I think we even had Alice Paul come to our delegation. So we had an American come in with her American attitude and come in and shame the Canadian federal politicians for not being progressive. And I think it's interesting, for students to see what was happening in other countries to gauge the pace of a movement, because sometimes change might seem slow, but when you compare it to other countries, you see that change might actually be quite fast. So we talk about whether change is happening or not in the context of other countries as well. So they do this cross-cultural comparison where the British suffragists are being quite, you know, violent. The American ones are going on hunger strikes. And we don't have a movie for the Canadian ones, unfortunately, which always gets my students goats as well. And maybe I tell them, well, one day when you are older, you can make the movie yourself. But the politicians, this is what they had to do. There was obviously speech making involved, and they had to create criteria for what would be an effective speech. Then they had to be prepared for answers from the press gallery, and they had to, of course, heckle the female delegation and then submit a letter to the editor of the women's pages that would reflect their view, so the conservative or liberal view of the time. And these are my students playing the male politicians. You can see here, this is me right here. So I think as a tip, if you're a teacher here, I always put myself in the role play so that it cannot go off the rails. And we would act like the people in the House of Commons, the MPs, because we would pass notes to each other and say things like, you're going on too long, or stop laughing, or whatever it is. And then that way you can make sure that everyone behaves. We had also, if you look here, quite a lot of audience members watching this. And so we want to make sure that, you know, they're not going to fall asleep because your speech is 10 minutes long, right? So that's, we did that in the gym. So if you're looking for like practical tips, we had to have an open space. We involved the civics class. They actually set up the House of Commons, so they had to use their knowledge of learning about government to do that, and then they became audience members as well. And then the suffragists were invited as a delegation, and they had to research their issues, make their pamphlets, prepare their answers to the questions, and submit their pamphlets for evaluation. If you have a large class, you have to think about who will all the roles be. Sometimes you have to put them into groups to do that. We have perspectives like this, Janie Smythe. So I didn't just go on the Nellie McClungs and the Emily Murphys, although they were there. But you have the little Janie Smythes who are writing to Flora Dennison, a feminist at the time, that she was so proud to vote, and that she's so thankful for women who fought for this. And she understands she's not going to be recognized by humanity at large as having a complete number of organs and faculties with more or less average mental ability to use them. And she now feels equal to her husband. So she then gives a shout out to the sisters, the nursing sisters. And I think, you know, it's very eye-opening for students to understand that even small history is big history, and we have all kinds of different women who are being invited to come share their points of view to the delegation. So at this point, you know, I had the video of the role play.
Ladies and gentlemen of the audience, of the cabinet, and of course, Mrs. McClung, I thank you for joining us here today to debate the highly controversial topic of women's enfranchisement. Undoubtedly, Mrs. McClung, your performance left a lasting impression on our cabinet minister and the representatives from the province of Manitoba. Your speeches are, without a doubt, ever enthralling and ever so amusing. I speak sincerely when I say that I, along with my supporters on the topic of voting rights, can greatly sympathize with the cause. If you feel you are being ill-treated by your government, then I offer you my most genuine apology. If you believe that your rights are being impeded and your work and rallies ignored, then I hope that through further discussion here today, we will be able to advance, if not resolve, the issues afflicting the women of this great nation. However, the heavy load of politics must, unfortunately, rest in the capable hands of men who have, for decades, dealt tremendously with this load. With that, I thank all those present here today. May you realize the truth and use it in your reasoning. May you judge well and fairly what must be done in this, our most beloved country of Canada.
No activist. My name is Augusta Stowe-Gullin. I am here to speak to you on behalf of all women in Canada. It has come to my understanding that only white women with male relatives may vote. Now, if you ask me, that is completely foolish and unfair. What about the women who are educated? The women the working woman, the women who know how to work war machines better than men. What about them? What makes them any different? These women sacrifice so much. They work hard, long, not to mention tiring hours. They work in very unhealthy factories, and worst of all, in very unsafe factories where anyone can get hurt at any time. Indeed, sirs, I shouldn't have to tell you that all women are capable of voting. Only a certain kind of female is able to vote, and some women can't vote at all. A woman's status should not be classified by the relationship with a man.
Now, gentlemen, I ask you to place yourselves 50 years from now. It'll be 1967. Wars would be a thing of the past. The suffragettes would no longer exist, for their issue would long ago have been resolved. Governments everywhere would welcome the voice of a woman in public affairs. And as such, women and children have access to free education and good health care. Daughters, mothers, and sisters would be considered persons in the eyes of the law. When Prime Minister Borden drafted legislation, he clearly did not check it over with his wife or his mother. He clearly underestimated the power of the feminine mind. Each and every single suffragette here today is of sound mind and intellect. We have been forced to take our cause to the streets and into theater. Our dear Nell here performs mock parliaments on a nightly basis to get you to open.
And these are the lovely suffragists, just on a practical side as well. So a lot of costuming involved here. So we brought in some mothers and grandmothers who helped, and I thought that was a really nice moment because they were sewing, and that's definitely an activity that brought women together over the years, and it also brought them into our school community, so that was a very nice experience, and they made their own costumes as well. I also, made regular trips to Value Village, and we studied the fashion of the time, so they tried to be as accurate as possible. They made their own hats, and then I kept them, of course, so that we could continue to amass our wardrobe for the role play. You see posters in the back there, so we had other students maybe who didn't feel comfortable playing a large role to do the stage design, so they actually studied suffragist pamphlets and posters of the time, and then they created their own to enhance kind of the role play. So here are all of the women that we had play suffragists. I tried to make sure I had provincial representation as well as linguistic, so French, English. There are no First Nations or diverse voices in here because we started that. It was very, very, very hard. I would say I spent a good 6 months looking for Black Canadian women's voices, and I will talk about that later in terms of how we could incorporate them. But these are the most successful women that I could find in terms of allowing the students to do research, because you want them to be able to find documents in primary sources. For the newspaper women, I came across an article called Women Who Made the News, Female Journalists in Canada, 1880 to 1945. And in there, it said something that really struck me, that women at that time required something more than recipes and baby lore to lift their horizons. The conduct of a social page, a beauty department, or a section on home adornment did not exhaust the possibilities of a newspaper woman. The field for really strong stuff on women's pages is deep, wide, and high, and it is barely scratched. So this is, many journalists, female journalists at the time were quite willing to be pioneers, and they wanted to have editorial control, and some editors gave them that, and that was very interesting to see. Things that we would have thought would not have been printed were actually printed. They were buried in the newspapers. But I love this idea of subversive, secretive, social rebellion or civil disobedience in that sense. And the students really like that too, because it's like a little bit of a hunt. Looking at the British examples, they were much, much more violent, or, maybe a little bit push the envelope a lot more in terms of their pamphlets and things. So we look at those as examples, and they can go more along those lines, or they can more do something that would appear in, say, the Toronto Times or something like that. So they had to form the press gallery, create a newspaper, according to the style of the time, and then consider the paper's stance. So they actually had to look up the paper. The best ones, in my opinion, were Grain Grower's Guide. If anyone's from the West here, they're always much more rebellious out there. And we had to also make sure they fit their audience, urban versus rural, society news and things like that. And then balance those with new political concerns. So you could do like a Dear Abby type of thing and use code language. And they would enroll, all the students were enrolled the whole time. So they had to interview each other as we moved from from play to debate. And here they are in the actual role play and in the play, and there are all their names. So Faith Fenton, they had pen names, Kit Coleman. They have very catchy names. The students really liked that, and they brought their little notepads and interviewed and made their newspapers. So I involved applied, academic, grade 10, and also we involved the theology classes who came as the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which was an interesting voice to have at the debate as well. So in terms of practicality, if you are thinking of a role play like this, certainly you have the link to the page. A lot of documents are on there. If you want to email me, my email's at the end and I can share more with you. But I involved as much of the school as possible, different history classes, different levels, theology, like I said. We involved parents as honored guests. They made the costumes, and we involved and invited women's groups, local media, the superintendent, the lieutenant governor of Ontario who attended one year, trustees from our school board. And if I had stayed at the school, would have started inviting elementary schools. I do think that it's nice to have this kind of chance to share with your community and give the students a real audience. The women's groups were over the moon when they saw what we were doing. So there we are, all of us in costume with the Lieutenant Governor of Ontario. And for my students from a small school, not very academically, it's not known for academics, they felt like they were given attention for the first time. And I think that's a very interesting experience, because certainly that woman, Janie Smythe, was saying, wow, this is the first time I feel people are listening to me. And then that way, real life kind of mimicked the past for my students. Does anyone have any questions? If you have questions now about the role play, you can post them there, and then I can address them now that it's fresh in your mind. Anything from the practical tips to maybe the theoretical side of it or the research side of it, you can just post them there in the side. I'll go over some other projects that you could undertake, or depending on what role you play. But we also did a memorial quilt. There's a link there for you from Halifax Women's History. The Canadian Red Cross Society would send over these Red Cross quilts in World War II, but we adapted it to World War I. And this idea of women playing this very essential role, although, today we debate with my male students about, oh, well, this is not equal to going and fighting at the Battle of the Somme or Passchendaele. Making a quilt is certainly not a sacrifice, but it's the idea of this home front contribution, these traditional roles fusing with new realities, and how women supported each other during times of hardship and created support groups. And this is a moving forward in terms of their advancements in society. The Women's Patriotic Fund, they took care of each other. And we made this quilt as kind of a tribute to those women who were sending over quilts to the war front. They learned how to sew, and they had to make the quilt together. So that is a nice experience, because their moms came in, and I have very diverse students, so we had all kinds of tips and tricks on how to sew from different cultures, which was very interesting, and then they presented it to the school as part of their Remembrance Day ceremonies. The other, there is the actual quilt right there, so you can see what it looked like. This was very successful because it was multiple perspectives. They had to also take on that perspective in a written assignment as well, and I can send that to you if you're interested. But it's kind of just thinking about how can you bring history into the wider school community, make it more alive for students, involve different cultures, and Thanks, Evelyn. It came to me in a dream, this idea, because I see this lately in society, kind of a throwback to people making their own things and sewing and quilting, and I think that's what is a traditional female activity that we might actually not think is that significant in society. But in fact, it was part of their story and part of their advancement. And so when you look at this quilt, it tells the whole story of Canada's experience in the war. Another activity I do, so those are kind of big activities. I will say that what I did is I taught the whole unit of World War I from the woman's perspective as we did that role play. So it was an entire unit, and we just looked at everything from that are in the overall expectations through that lens. We do also debate, did women make advancements as a result of World War I using primary sources? There's lots of good stuff out there where women were exercising a lot of agency, you know, writing things down, being interviewed by the Toronto Daily Star about their working hours, writing home and complaining about the conditions as farmerettes, and also, you know, patting themselves on the back in terms of entering the workforce. And then we have here sort of a juxtaposition, the traditional role, the new role, the sort of integration of these roles. And then, you know, it's just a good conversation around this fixation on what is the role of the woman. And men, I don't think my male students ever ask themselves, well, what is my role in society, and who should I be based on my gender? And I don't see too much of that in textbooks either. So this idea of what should people do based on who they are in terms of a gender is an interesting concept. So we use a both sides now chart to do that. And I love this quote too. They are killing us off as fast as they are killing the men in the trenches. And these women were not fooling around. They were not saying, oh yes, we'll do anything for the war effort, because sometimes I think it's depicted that way in textbooks, like they just hiked up their socks and went to the factory and they didn't complain and they just loved every minute of it. And that's not necessary. I mean, it's wonderful to say, well, look at these women and look at their contribution, but I think it almost glosses over the reality of what happened. Like, it was hard. And it's same thing for soldiers. There are a ton of soldiers that were not loving their experience, and I think that's great for discussing the construction of history. Here as well, we talk about, well, what is progress then for women? In my research on Black Canadian women, which was very extensive, the best source I could find was No Burden to Carry. So if you're interested in finding out more about women's roles during the war, and also just in general in terms of their struggles in Canada, this is a great resource. And one of the things that it raises is this idea of, well, once the women left their domestic roles, like domestic servants, for example, which was a job, and they went to the factories, Black Canadian women filled those roles, and that was considered progress to them. So as one group moves up, another group takes their spot. And here I have a great visual of the textile industry, the garment industry, where we see definitely immigrant women taking on the role of now those women who have moved on to something else. So equality or steps forward happen in stages, and we talk about whether that is that progress, is that right, is that good that that's happening? And we have this quote from Dion Brand that it wasn't until 1940 that you only saw a significant number of Black Canadian women working at industrial labor. Most 80% still in the 40s and 50s worked in domestic service. So are we looking down on that role? Is that not progress to us? And she suggests that, you know, they did this industrialization didn't have the impact on Black women wage earners as it did on white women. And so there's lots and lots of layers and things to discuss there. Other projects we've done are to have a 1920s role play party, where you have your Matchless Six coming, your track and field athletes, your Mary Pickfords, your flappers. So we have all kinds of different women playing these roles, and then you have your traditional tea-drinking WCTU women, and they all interact with each other and express their different points of view. So there you get the many different historical perspectives. Along the lines of just going back to here, I have some resources that I'll post at the end for this idea of working women, because I'm currently very interested in Helen Armstrong, and this is maybe kind of an Alice Paul type of character who was president of the Labor League. Okay, so we have 5 more minutes. And I will just move along here so you can see a couple of other things. Progress or decline for women in the 1920s. This is a certificate of registration for a Sikh woman. Sikhs were in Canada for quite a bit of time in the 20s, and they were one of the groups that assimilated most, I would say, visibly into the British culture. And so we talk about whether or not that's progress for them, because they, their sons, cut their hair and wore British clothing. And we talk about, this woman here in Kensington Market, whether or not it's a time of progress for her compared to her, still doing manual labor. And also, this is the Olympic women going to the Olympics in 1929. So when we think about Famous Five, or we think about flappers, how do these stories sync with those stories? And then they put this all on a timeline of progress or decline. They have to decide what is the most progressive moments of the 20s and what are the least progressive moments, and that always lends itself to a lot of debate. And we're calling that a timeline with attitude, and some people call it a living graph as well. The last thing I'd like to discuss is the person's case. This is certainly a story that we know well, and we know the names of the women, and this raises a connection to Evelyn's point about who exactly could be a suffragist or who could be a women's rights activist. Certainly these women operated in specific circles and had access to certain people in order to achieve their goals, which is wonderful and great, and we are very appreciative, but the story doesn't really get told. And my students, the co-ed students, maybe for a lot of the boys this was an eye-opener, the idea that there is also this person behind the person's case. And if you want to investigate this more, it is actually the story of Alice Jamieson, who was a judge in Calgary, and she had a vagrant, a prostitute appear before her, whose name was Lizzie Sear. And it was really this case that started the person's case, but it involves a Métis prostitute, a woman who had no position in society, and she was sentenced to 6 months hard labor for giving a man syphilis. And it was a woman who sentenced her, and the male lawyer challenged Alice Jamieson, the judge. And this has been completely taken out of the story of the person's case. So if we're talking about how history is constructed and why do we only talk about these women? There's all children's books about these women, websites, wonderful, all kinds of wonderful resources, but you don't really get much about this woman right here. So I gave you the article. It's in the Beaver, which Canada's history. So shout out to these magazines. They are excellent resources, and you can investigate it more. But this is really the starting point. And we talk about why her story didn't make it in. And here are other resources for you. This is all of the books I use on a regular basis in the magazine article. This is a very good one, The Canadian Housewife, as well. So that's I'll end it there in terms of what I've done with my students, and I can open it up to discussion now, and I'll start posting some resources for you as well. Thank you for your attention. Thank you, Evelyn, for being my most enthusiastic student.
Thank you, Diane. I'm just going to... So thank you again, Diane, for your presentation. This is the first time we've actually had a presentation that's gone step by step, like these are the projects that you can do to teach this topic in your classroom. And I think with your experiences teaching all women and teaching co-ed classrooms, you've brought something very new to the table for myself anyways. I'm not sure what everybody else is thinking, so if you want to talk about that I think we would like to see those comments.
Yeah.
So thank you very much.
You're welcome. You know, one of the things I think is frustrating sometimes about PD or webinars and stuff is that you can't actually get into the practical side of how do you plan things and what does it look like. So I try to bring that to the table, and I just posted 2 links there to this Mrs. Armstrong. There's actually a documentary called The Notorious Mrs. Armstrong, and you could teach the Winnipeg General Strike just from her story, since the story has been told from the male perspective for so long, and you would still meet all of the expectations and be exposing students to what I would not consider to be revolutionary, but for many teachers across the province and many students, they are not getting alternative perspectives. So anything I can do to provide practical tips is my pleasure. And so so thank you very much for allowing me to share. The other thing that I'm currently working on is looking at women in the 1970s from a Royal Commission on the Status of Women through just looking at Canadian women's experience as Mounties when they first began recruiting women in the 1970s. And the starting point actually for that also comes from Canada's History magazine. And I'm going to post the link to that article in case anyone is interested in exploring that as well. And it's this actual article right here from August and September 2011. So maybe just, keep in mind you can actually achieve all the expectations of the grade 10 history course by picking maybe a different perspective. Certainly, you could do different races and ages of women, different provincial representations, and then kind of wrapping the story around that and using sources to bring out other parts of the story as well, but keeping that your primary focus.